My lords, ladies, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my very great pleasure on behalf of my Director General, our staff, and the many members and associates and friends we have today to welcome our guests, Bill Gates and Ruth Davidson, to RUSI tonight. As you all know, RUSI is an independent, non-partisan think tank which promotes debate and conducts research on critical issues of defence, security, and international affairs. And we live for such events. We're absolutely delighted to have this event today. The timing was, of course, entirely deliberate. And we relish the star power which you bring to us tonight, which we will ruthlessly use to promote the issues that you're going to talk about. I think it's fair to say that successive British governments have recognised that to be a truly internationalist power in the best of our national traditions, to be a world leader requires strong armed forces, cutting-edge security services, and the very best diplomats. And it also requires sustained investment in development, working alongside diplomacy and defence to help tackle problems of war and poverty with all their malign consequences for global security and indeed for our own security back here in the UK. And that's why, while defence remains at the very heart of what we as RUSI do, we also take a full spectrum approach to tackling issues of defence and security being part of our name as the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. It's why we at RUSI have an office in Nairobi, which is doing innovative work to tackle the roots of violent extremism and terrorism in Kenya and Somalia. It's why we do work on organised crime and modern slavery, international terrorism, tracing the roots of those phenomena which generate security challenges here in the UK and Europe. And it's why I'm especially pleased on this occasion to acknowledge that we have just started in cooperation with the Overseas Development Institute and with kind support from the Gates Foundation, a new project on aid, security, and the UK's role in the world, which will, I hope, inform the policies of whatever government emerges from the general election, the starting gun for which was fired in Parliament today. So now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over the proceedings to our distinguished chairman, Lord Hague. William, please.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this gathering of specially invited guests at RUSI tonight. And my first duty, since you've been drinking some excellent wine upstairs, is to thank John Hunt for the wine. Give him a round of applause. And I'm delighted to see you all here, including many members of Parliament who've had a slightly busy day. We Lords have not had to trouble ourselves with these democratic exercises today, but some of them are here. And it makes all the more timely what has happened today, our discussions tonight about global leadership and about UK overseas aid and its use to save lives and to keep us safe. We are one of the world's most generous countries in overseas development aid. We're one of the few that meets the UN target of 0.7% of national income devoted to that purpose. And as Foreign Secretary, I was often encouraged and inspired by what I saw about how that money is used and what can be achieved with it. I regularly heard great praise for the UK around the world for what we do, although I didn't often hear other countries promise to do the same and make the same commitment. But we have here a man tonight who puts into perspective the efforts of nations, an extraordinary man, Bill Gates, who has used his wealth to do more in delivering effective aid than most of the world's great nations have managed to do, and who, along with his wife Melinda and their colleagues, is guided by the belief that every life has equal value, and on that belief, based on that belief, they have provided billions of dollars to improve people's health and to help them out of extreme hunger and poverty. And the dedication that he and his family and colleagues have shown to these goals on a vast scale makes them among the greatest philanthropists of the world, and indeed that the world has ever known. And Mr. Gates, we're extremely honored to have you with us here in London tonight. And we're also joined by Ruth Davidson, and I have a non-political hat on tonight as chair of RUSI. So I won't say things that I would say about a fellow conservative, except I think across the political spectrum. I think I can fairly say she is respected for her honesty and directness and originality and thoughtfulness in politics. She's passionate about this subject. I read an interview with her recently where, of course, she pointed out her ambition is to be the First Minister of Scotland, but she said the one thing that could possibly one day tempt her to Westminster would be the prospect of being International Development Secretary. And who says she can't do both of those things and many more in a long political career that many of us hope is there for her in the future? So each of them is going to speak to us. Their speeches are on the record, but the Q&A session that we'll then have after that for 15-20 minutes or so is off the record and is not to be attributed. I hope everyone can respect those rules. So, Mr. Gates, I invite you to address us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lord Haig, for that kind introduction. And also, thank you for the great work you're doing to prevent sexual violence against women in conflict. It's a great honor to be here, and I particularly want to recognize Lord Haig and Ruth Davidson and all of you involved in politics for coming at such a busy time. 2017 has already seared some painful image into our minds. The terrorist attack outside Parliament, children writhing from chemical attacks in Syria, and starvation in both Yemen and East Africa. The continued despair and desperation of a large number of refugees. If we simply base our worldview on the headlines and these bad developments, it's easy to conclude that things are getting worse. But the headlines are not the trend lines, and the data makes a very different case. Viewed through the lens of the human condition and any way of measuring that condition, our world is improving for humanity. And so we have an opportunity to take the lessons of what's gone well and to build on that progress, or to look at what's been tough and allow the forces of uncertainty and fear to slow or reverse this progress. I, as you might guess, believe that we should build. We should recognize the great progress and accelerate that. We have accomplished a lot. There's several ways to look at this. For example, literacy. If you go back to 1930, only 3 out of 10 people in the world could read. Today, 8 out of 10 are literate. And in fact, the greatest acceleration in literacy in the last 20 years has taken place in Africa. By the turn of the century, we should expect that almost everyone will have a formal education. As recently as 1950, 3/4 of the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number is down below 10%. The last 25 years, we more than cut that in half. In 1990, over 12 million kids below the age of 5 died. It was 10% of all the kids under 5. Today, that number is 5%, less than 6 million. And in the next 15 years, we'll cut it in half again. It'll be 2.5%, 2.5 million kids. So that's really kind of amazing. It's a very basic thing that children should survive, and we're achieving that goal. These achievements are the result of a unique convergence. Industrialization and technological innovation have led to greater productivity and prosperity. Scientific advancement has made it possible to live healthier, longer lives. And the growth of capitalism, free markets, and trade has pulled more families into the middle class. Foreign aid has been a key element of this progress. It has ensured that as humanity has made leaps, those benefits extend even to poor countries to help them get out of a poverty trap and eventually become self-sufficient. So in many, many ways, we've broken a cycle of poverty and disease that otherwise would have been a trap. Still, those who do not realize how much progress has been unlocked worry that aid is a waste or that the benefits don't really come and help the country that gives that aid. The truth is that investing in the health and well-being of people in a poor country pays dividends far beyond that country's borders. The UK foreign aid investments are, in fact, long-term investments in the health and security even of British citizens here at home. It concerns me that some world leaders are interpreting recent events as reasons to turn inward instead of seeing them what they are. Problems that, although they're difficult and will take time, can be solved if we invest in the long-term solutions that are necessary. And that's the case I want to make today. If you could only pick one number to highlight the effectiveness of the development agenda since 1990, I would pick the number 122 million. That's the number of children's lives that have been saved. Saving children's lives is a phenomenal investment that foreign aid allows. Because as you bring down that child-to-death rate, families choose to have less children. Population goes down very substantially, which brings within reach all of the things society is trying to do. Better health, better education, economic opportunity, all of those things show up as you bring mortality down. So by doing this, you lay the foundation for greater prosperity and stability. So why have we had this huge drop in childhood mortality? It's actually quite simple. More children in poor countries are getting the packages of vaccines that every child in the US and the UK has been getting for years. Those vaccines that prevent diarrheal disease, respiratory disease, have been brought down to be very, very low cost. And so this is high impact aid. Every dollar spent saves $16 in health costs. And when you look at the broader economic impact on disease and illness, vaccines return $44 for every dollar invested. And that's money developing countries can invest in nutrition, health clinics, and schools. The UK government has long understood the incredible value of immunization. 17 years ago, it was the UK government, together with our foundation, which were two of the founding partners for Gavi, the vaccine alliance that makes sure that all children in poor countries get the same vaccines that kids in rich countries get. Through DFID's contribution to Gavi, UK taxpayers have prevented millions and millions of deaths and will save over 1 million more lives in just the next 3 years. So Gavi's a good example of the kind of innovative multilateral approach to development aid that DFID and our foundation have invested in together because it's proven to work. Let me give you a few other examples. The UK and our foundation were also founders of the Global Fund. That was created to help developing countries to prevent and treat the 3 big infectious diseases, HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. Between now and 2020, UK support for the Global Fund will save over 2 million lives. The medicine that keeps people alive from HIV only costs $100 a year. And so it's phenomenal that the world decided that it was only fair that that money should be raised and those lives should be saved. And it's made an incredible difference in Africa. Another example is the UK investment in the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. We would have had 1.6 million people paralyzed by polio since the start of that eradication campaign if the money wasn't there, driving this infectious disease down to 0 cases. This year, so far, we've had 5 cases, and with any luck, this will be the last year that any child is paralyzed from polio. After 3 years of no cases, then this will become certified as the second human disease ever to be eradicated after smallpox all the way back in 1980. The UK has also been a great leader in the campaign to get rid of what are called neglected tropical diseases. Though virtually unknown in wealthy countries, these diseases, called things like elephantitis or African sleeping sickness, have caused unimaginable suffering for hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. 5 years ago, the UK hosted a meeting here in London with the world's pharmaceutical companies and other backers who pledged to eliminate 10 of these diseases. I was just in Geneva this morning, where we gathered to take a measure of the progress over these 5 years, and it's quite amazing. We're reaching 1 billion people a year with donated treatments for these terrible diseases. It's a scale unmatched in the history of public health. The UK has underscored the value of this effort with a new commitment that was made on Sunday that will protect more than 200 million people in the next 4 years from the suffering caused by these diseases. So what do these initiatives have in common? First, they build on the best of what we've learned about what works. Second, by pooling resources and aligning interests of both wealthy and poor countries, they show that everyone is working together on the same goals. And third, they're effectively run. They keep overhead to a minimum, leveraging the expertise of professionals in organizations like DFID and the World Health Organization. And finally, they draw on private sector expertise, which is often vital to make sure the poor countries have access to high-quality, affordable health products. The point is that aid has a huge positive impact. And as I mentioned, it also has benefits at home. For example, aid, by building up these healthcare systems, will allow us to see deadly pandemic diseases early on and prevent them from spreading far and wide in Africa before we can get them under control. Even in the case of Ebola, that didn't spread as fast as some diseases that are likely to come in the decade ahead, that almost got out of control. And only by using a lot of emergency resources, including, in the case of the UK and the US, some defense resources, only with that intervention was it stopped. Whether the next epidemic is unleashed by a quirk of nature or the hand of a terrorist, scientists say that a human-to-human transmissible pathogen could kill more than 30 million people in less than a year. That's whether it's a form of flu like 1919 or a terrorist-engineered form of smallpox. A disease like that will become an unstoppable epidemic if they get started in countries that are completely unstable and don't have functioning health systems. So a health crisis somewhere in the world can become a health crisis everywhere. We can't build a wall to hold back the next global epidemic. We need to combat it and the underlying socioeconomic problems at the source. And that's where foreign aid comes in. Military leaders, like some of those in this room, understand this. Aid makes vulnerable parts of the world less prone to conflict and collapse. When U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis was a senior commander in the U.S. military, he told Congress, if you don't fund the State Department development budget, then I need to buy more ammunition. 9 senior British military officers reinforced this in 2013 when they wrote that the coupling of defense spending and foreign aid, the combination of hard and soft power, is one of the UK's greatest strategic assets. Foreign aid plays a critical role in helping countries become self-sufficient. Take child health. When people no longer have to worry if their children will survive into adulthood, they decide to have fewer children. It's incredibly powerful how quickly that connection between good health leads to reductions in population growth. And then that growth going down allows you to feed, to educate, and create opportunities for people. This is particularly true when women have the tools to plan and space their births. Yet even today, millions of women in the developing world don't have access to modern contraception. Solving this problem is another area where the UK has been a leader. 5 years ago, DFID hosted another summit here in London. It launched the global effort to reach an additional 120 million women and girls with family planning services. This summer, my wife, together with DFID, will co-host another summit here to ensure that the world delivers on this promise. This will be yet another moment where British leadership will help make the lives of women and girls around the world better. Some people make the argument that foreign aid will be needed forever. To the contrary, smart aid enables countries to take ownership of their future by encouraging investment in things like better healthcare, better schools, and agriculture, which are the key building blocks of self-sufficiency. Just as the Marshall Plan helped Europeans rebuild the continent themselves after World War II, targeted aid today helps countries lift themselves out of poverty and chart their own future. Still, when it comes to aid, just like all investments, you need to keep a close eye on it. You need to keep learning. As somebody who puts $5 billion a year toward development aid, I have a strong interest in making sure our money is well spent. This is especially true because half of the money we give comes from Warren Buffett, who hates wasting money even more than I do. I also have a strong interest in making sure that our partners, especially our closest partners like DFID, are making a good return on their investment, because that's the only way we'll achieve the shared ambition of a world where the poorest countries can stand on their own. Given the recent wave of newspaper reports suggesting the UK's aid money isn't being well spent, I feel it's important for someone like me who works on foreign aid every day to make the case for the facts. So let me be clear. The overall impact of this aid is quite phenomenal. Now, when aid is mismanaged, it is a double crime, stealing both from the taxpayer and the poor. Secretary Patel has been very clear that any waste is unacceptable and partners must deliver results. And when there have been mistakes, DFID will make changes. But let's be clear. The bulk of this aid is getting to its recipients and having an incredible effect. There'll always be a need to adjust. We're working in very tough countries, and so you'll never get 100% perfect effectiveness. But you can learn, and every year the aid is better spent. Foreign aid today is far more strategic than it was 10 years ago. The British government has courageously taken up the difficult but vital challenge of working in the most fragile countries, because these are often the areas of greatest need. Making these countries more stable makes the world safer, but it's not easy. As the people in this room know better than most, fragile states are where it's most difficult to operate. Yet even with these challenges, DFID is widely recognized as one of the most effective, efficient, and innovative aid agencies in the world. I get to see the impact of DFID's work on the ground, and I wish all British taxpayers could too. You are the reason that malaria deaths are down in entire villages, and life-saving vaccines are now reaching kids in the most remote parts of the world. Make no mistake, our foundation expects dramatic results. And it's exactly for that reason that I've chosen to invest our foundation's resources over and over again working alongside DFID. Because in DFID, we see a kindred organization that believes in rigor, results, and outcomes. I've seen calls by some newspapers and politicians to abandon the UK's cross-party commitment to spend 0.7% of its gross national income on international development. This target was first set out by the United Nations back in 1970 as a framework for wealthy countries to work together to reduce extreme poverty. It's been discussed, debated, and affirmed many times. This commitment provides developing countries with the predictability they need to budget and plan. It's important that they know that these resources will come long term so they can invest in the training and the systems, for example, primary health care or vaccination or nourishment programs so that children can succeed in school. The Prime Minister made clear in her January visit to my country and more recently in a speech in Scotland that she sees the 0.7% as a critical pillar of Britain's foreign policy. In my view, Britain should be praised for sticking to this commitment. It was a well-considered decision that sets an example for other countries. It's visible proof of the UK's goodwill and humanity. Withdrawing aid would cost lives, which is reason enough to continue it, but would also create a leadership vacuum that others will fill, undermining the UK's influence. It is reassuring to know that as Britain prepares to leave the European Union, it will not step back from the world. As people who will shape foreign policy in a post-Brexit Britain, I hope that you will speak up for aid as a vital national interest that's essential for ensuring a more stable world. The Prime Minister said recently that British aid speaks strongly to the values that have long defined Britain as a beacon of hope and optimism, a country that won't turn its back on those in need, and a country that will always meet its commitments to the most vulnerable. This kind of leadership, and the leadership of people like Lord Haig, Ruth Davidson, and MPs from all parties, is what will assure a more secure and prosperous future for both Britain and people everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gates, for an important speech and an important moment to make it. And now Ruth Davidson is going to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It feels a little bit like Boxing Day. You've had the main event and now there's the tidying up to do. I was exceptionally honoured last year to be invited to an event that Bill Gates did in the House of Commons where he was talking to the Compassionate Conservative Caucus there. And the ability to seek questions and answers and to see the investment that he makes, not just in terms of the material investment, the investment of time, of his own integrity, his knowledge, his understanding of the work that the Foundation does, was really exceptional to be able to see. He's talked a little bit today about immunisation, and I would like this evening just to chat about a couple of other issues that I think are important. The first being landmine clearance and the second being the education of girls and women. I'm also going to talk just a very little bit at the end with a bit of the politics. As Mr. Gates said, there have been question marks within some of the national newspapers in this country from some of the people that operate in the large house just down the road about whether the United Kingdom should stick to its 0.7 aid target as set down by the United Nations when some other countries don't do the same. I believe passionately that we should. I believe not only is that in the interests of the countries that are the recipient of the work that is done, but I think it is also in our national interest too. And I want to make very briefly the right of centre case for pursuing aid as well. So first of all, I wasn't always a politician. I used to be a journalist a very long time ago. And one of the things that I've never forgotten from my time when I was a very young journalist was spending some time in Kosovo during the Balkan War and seeing the sort of work that Scottish troops and British troops were doing over there and having it impressed upon me that our country, the United Kingdom, is a force for good in the world. I've always kept a bit of an interest in the Balkans, and I sit at the moment on the board of a charity that takes people from this country over to Bosnia, to Srebrenica, to look at the genocide that happened there, to speak to the mothers and the survivors. And it pains me every time I go back to that region of the world to see that there are still fenced-off parts, just a few hundred miles from where we stand today, with big mine tapes that say you can't go here, children who are maimed, areas of land that can't be worked. And there is a big push that's happening right now to make sure that we can make the world landmine-free. Bill Gates talked about polio being the next smallpox. Well, we're also standing on a smallpox moment here on being able to clear these devices country by country around the world. And Britain is playing an integral part of that. For those of you who are, like me, old enough to remember, about 20 years ago, in fact 20 years ago in just a couple of months' time, Princess Diana worked very hard, went out to Angola, put on the suit and walked in a minefield and shone a light on something that really hadn't been discussed before. Later that year, the Ottawa Accord was signed by countries around the world to say that we would no longer manufacture, that we would no longer allow our armed forces to use anti-personnel mines and landmines in this way. And since then, we've seen stockpiles destroyed. We've seen thousands of exceptionally brave men and women working across the globe to clear tracts of land. And today, nearly 80% of all landmine clearance that happens in the world is done by two charities. One of them is the Halo Trust, the banner that Princess Diana was in Angola under, and the other is by the Mines Advisory Group. Both of these charities are British. Both employ a significant number of former UK military personnel, and both rely on funding from governments and multinational agencies. And both are truly deserving, I believe, of our support and the support of the wider international community. Because landmines do continue to kill and maim. In 2015, almost 5,000 people were injured and over 1,600 died via landmines and other explosive devices that have been left behind after a conflict. Casualties are higher now than at any time in the last decade. And horrifically, we're once again seeing landmines being used in places like Yemen and in Syria. And the thing about them is they're indiscriminate. This isn't about a war where it's one side versus the other, fully paid up soldiers doing a professional job. They hit the world's poorest communities hardest. They hit the innocents once people have packed up and gone home. And they are a lingering reminder that war touches people long after the guns fall silent. There are now 3 years since parties to that original landmine treaty kind of got together and adopted something called the Maputo +15 Declaration, pledging to try and make the world landmine-free by 2025. And it's a tough ask, a really tough ask. It requires leadership, it requires political will, it requires money. But it is doable, and I'm so proud that the UK is throwing its weight behind it. And earlier this month, the UK government pledged over £100 million to support landmine clearance over the next 3 years. It is a tripling of support, and it will allow us to clear 150 square kilometres of contaminated land and support communities in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in South Sudan, and in Cambodia. I cannot tell you how hard it is to reprofile a Department of Government, and I think the work that Priti Patel and Rory Stewart have done to put this right to the top of the agenda, to work with others around the world, cannot, irrespective of your politics, cannot be saluted enough. And the very fact that one of the G7 nations, the United Kingdom, is taking a lead in this area, is willing to stand up there at the very first and say, we're going to try and do this. We can clear, country by country, these devices that are maiming and killing hundreds, that are meaning that there is not the sort of economic development, the land development that needs to happen, means that we can help leverage support from other countries too that want to help. So I believe that it's not only our moral imperative to act, but it's also in our national interest. Because the things that mine clearance does is it allows local populations to see their land returned to them. It allows them to see them returned to them by brave men and women that happen to be wearing Union flag patches on their arms, so it's a great projection of soft power. It stabilises chaotic regions. It makes life harder for terrorist recruiters, because if you've got young men of recruitment age that are actually in work, that are actually involved in their own communities, building their own future, it makes them much harder to recruit. It frees up land for farming, for housing, for tourism. It encourages jobs, and it decreases the need for people to attempt to migrate to Western Europe, as we've seen in the migration crisis. And I am confident that where Britain leads, others will follow, and that together we can sustain a truly global effort to eradicate these abhorrent weapons of war once and for all. But aid isn't just about providing security, despite what the banner behind me says. It's also about providing opportunity. And launched 5 years ago, the Department for International Development's Girls' Education Challenge is one of the single biggest providers of female education anywhere in the world. And in Britain, we hardly know anything about it. We don't bang our drum anywhere nearly enough. It's helped over 1.1 million disadvantaged girls go to school. It's constructed and renovated over 3,500 classrooms. It's trained almost 65,000 teachers, and it has distributed more than 7 million textbooks. And it's vital work, because we know that gender inequalities in education are the greatest in the poorest countries, and that adolescent girls in particular face specific challenges to staying in school and to learning. And in many contexts, as girls approach puberty, their opportunities can shrink in comparison to their brothers. Girls and young women also face a disproportionate burden of domestic work and a far greater risk of violence, including sexual violence. And the work that Lord Hague and his colleagues have done on this has been truly immense. And to combat this, last July, DFID announced a £100 million of further funding for the Girls' Education Challenge, stretching our ambition to leave no girl behind. And British Aid will support the empowerment of young girls through a range of avenues, from catch-up clubs, from mentoring and life skill programmes, to ensuring that young women are also able to access training opportunities. But the scale of that challenge is enormous. 63 million girls around the world are out of school, with half of these in sub-Saharan Africa. And while we can't change this overnight, we can and we must use our influence to promote women's rights abroad, ensuring access to the kind of opportunities that we take for granted. Women's and girls' education is like dropping a pebble in the pond, and the ripples go on forever, because it's not just about adding literacy to somebody's individual life. It reduces infant mortality. It changes attitudes to cultural norms and violence against women. It allows huge gains in public health improvements. It encourages economic growth and activity. And this is exactly what UK aid delivers. And since 2011, it's helped 10 million women use modern family planning methods, and it's supported midwives who've attended 5 million births. In that same period, British Aid has supported almost 40 million women to gain access to financial services and to understand that their property rights, and to give them economic empowerment. Quite simply, British Aid continues to transform lives for the better, and it's a cause that we must continue to champion. And I think that now, not just because we had an announcement yesterday there was going to be another general election, but at a time where you look at elections that have happened around the world, the people who are taking power, the people who are seeking to take power in elections that are yet to come, there is a worry. There is a real worry that as a global community, we're withdrawing from each other. As somebody that's never much liked measuring inputs, because I'd much rather look at outputs and outcomes, the one exception that I will make is for the 0.7% that the UN has asked people to give towards aid. I think particularly at this time, as the United Kingdom chooses to leave the European Union, it is so important that we demonstrate to our allies and friends around the world that we're not withdrawing from the global community, that we are good global citizens. Now, it is imperative that we use our aid better, and we are working so hard in DFID to make sure that we do. And I think that Bill Gates's analogy of it being a double crime because you take from the taxpayer and you take from the poor is absolutely the right one. But aid worked well is a double benefit too, because it helps the country that receives and it helps the rest of the world improve. So while there are siren voices across this country and others saying that we should scale back our commitment to others around the world, I say that this is a country that has always shouldered its burden, that has always believed in being a good global citizen. And I, and many others I know within my party and in other parties, will fight to ensure that that does not change. Irrespective of what other countries choose to do, the United Kingdom will continue to lead. Thank you.